17 years. 10 generations. The MacBook Air went from a party trick Steve Jobs pulled from an envelope to the best laptop most people can buy. Here is every single one. Let's break this down. MacBook Air. January 15th, 2008, Macworld Conference, San Francisco, and Steve Jobs reaches into a manila inner office envelope sitting on his stool and withdraws a laptop. The moment became one of the most replicated product reveal images in consumer electronics history. Apple had positioned the original MacBook Air as the world's thinnest notebook, 19 millimeters at its thickest point, 4 millimeters thinner than the previous record holder, the 2005 Toshiba Portage R200. The wedge tapered to a feather edge at the front. It was genuinely breathtaking to hold in an era when laptops were thick, heavy slabs of plastic and aluminium. The technical reality underneath the design was harder to overlook. The original Air shipped with a custom low-voltage Intel Core 2 Duo processor that throttled under sustained load. It had a single USB 2.0 port, a micro DVI output, and a 3.5mm headphone jack, nothing else. The base storage was an 80 gigabyte spinning hard drive running at 4,200 revolutions per minute, slow enough that users could feel it. A 64 gigabyte solid-state option cost an additional $999 at a time when the base laptop already started at $1,799. Reviewers were captivated by the hardware and honest about the compromises. Walt Mossberg of the Wall Street Journal called it the best-looking laptop he had ever seen, and then spent several paragraphs explaining why most people should not buy it. The port situation was so extreme that Apple sold an external USB optical drive as an accessory because the Air had no room for one internally. A late 2008 refresh replaced the hard drive with a faster SSD standard option, swapped the micro DVI for mini DisplayPort, and added an NVIDIA GeForce GPU. Improvements that acknowledged the 2008 launch had shipped before the engineering was finished. MacBook Air 2010. October 20th, 2010, and Apple releases a machine that retroactively makes the 2008 original look like a prototype. The second generation MacBook Air is the design that everyone pictures when they say MacBook Air. The tapered wedge enclosure machined from a single piece of aluminium, solid-state storage made standard across every configuration, a second USB port added on the opposite side, and a smaller 11.6-inch model introduced alongside the 13-inch for the first time. The 11-inch Air started at $999 and became one of the most beloved small laptops Apple ever made, thin enough to slide into a book bag pocket and light enough to forget it was there. Apple cut the starting price of the 13-inch from $1,799 to $1,299, a $500 reduction that reflected what solid-state storage costs had done over 2 years and what Apple was willing to accept as a margin. Performance improved meaningfully over the 2008 model. The new micro DisplayPort connection had been replaced by nothing at all on the 11-inch. The port selection remained minimal, but the SSD made the difference between a laptop that felt fast in daily use and one that did not. Boot times dropped dramatically, application launch felt instant. Battery life reached approximately 5 hours on the 11-inch and 7 on the 13-inch, which was competitive for the category at the time. The 2010 Air established the product template that Apple would refine for the next decade: extreme portability, solid-state storage, as the non-negotiable foundation, premium aluminium construction, and a price that positioned it as aspirational but attainable. Every subsequent generation was measured against this one. MacBook Air 2011 through 2013. The 3-year span from mid-2011 to mid-2013 represents the Intel MacBook Air at the height of its capability. Each annual update delivered a meaningful generational improvement that justified the existence of a new machine without requiring the previous one to feel obsolete. The mid-2011 update introduced Sandy Bridge Intel Core i5 and i7 processors, the backlit keyboards that had been absent from the previous generation, Thunderbolt connectivity, and Bluetooth 4.0. The backlit keyboard was not a minor convenience addition. Its absence had been a genuine complaint that put the Air behind competitors in low-light usability, and its return was treated by reviewers as a restoration rather than a new feature. The mid-2012 revision brought Ivy Bridge processors, HD Graphics 4000, USB 3.0, alongside the existing Thunderbolt port, and a 720p FaceTime camera upgrade. The base memory increased to 4 GB. The mid-2013 update was the most significant. Haswell processors arrived and transformed battery life in a way that no previous Intel chip transition had managed. The 13-inch Air reached 12 hours of real-world battery life on a single charge, which Apple advertised as the longest of any Mac notebook. The Haswell 13-inch became the recommendation for anyone who traveled and needed a reliable machine that would last a full working day without hunting for an outlet. The 802.11a C Wi-Fi that arrived in 2013 completed the picture. For many buyers, the 2013 MacBook Air remains the best Intel laptop Apple ever made, not because of raw performance, but because every component was in balance with every other, and the result felt finished in a way that iterative updates rarely achieve. MacBook Air, 2014 through 2017. The 4-year period from 2014 to 2017 is the MacBook Air's stagnation chapter, and unlike the stagnation stories of the Mac Pro or the Mac Mini during the same era, this one is harder to excuse because the product was Apple's highest volume laptop, the machine students bought, the machine that filled university libraries and coffee shops, the machine that more people interacted with daily than any other Mac. The updates across these 4 years were processor refreshes. Early 2014 brought a Haswell Core i5 speed bump. 2015 added a Broadwell processor and slightly improved battery life. 2017 delivered a Kaby Lake update. None of these changed the fundamental machine. The display remained a 1440 by 900 pixel TN panel on the 13-inch, the same resolution Apple had shipped in 2010, at a time when the MacBook Pro had carried a Retina display since 2012 and competitors were shipping 1080p and above as standard. Every year from 2012 onward, a buyer comparing a new MacBook Air to a new MacBook Pro experienced the same moment of recognition. The Air's display was noticeably inferior. Apple's position was that the Air served a different purpose: portability and price over display quality. The 11-inch model was discontinued quietly in 2016 without announcement, eliminating the smallest option in the lineup without a replacement. By 2017, the MacBook Air was 4 years behind in display technology, surrounded by competitors offering Retina-equivalent panels at comparable prices, and Apple was selling it unchanged. The machine that had defined the ultra-portable category was becoming the cautionary example of what happens when a manufacturer stops investing in its most popular product. MacBook Air, 2018 and 2019. October 2018. And Apple delivers the MacBook Air's first meaningful redesign in 8 years, and the most consequential keyboard disaster in the product's history simultaneously. The 2018 Air introduced a Retina display at 2560 by 1600 pixels, reducing the bezels around it and producing an image quality improvement so visible that reviewers who had been frustrated with the previous display for years spent entire paragraphs describing it. Touch ID arrived on the MacBook Air for the first time, embedded in the power button. The weight dropped slightly. The footprint shrank. It genuinely felt like a next-generation machine rather than a specification update. The keyboard was the butterfly mechanism, the same low-travel scissor replacement that Apple had been using in MacBook Pros since 2015, and that had generated a growing, documented record of unreliable key mechanisms where individual keys would stop registering keystrokes after debris entered the assembly through gaps around the key caps. A class action lawsuit covering the butterfly keyboard mechanism was filed in 2018. Apple replaced keyboards under repair programs. The 2019 update added True Tone display technology and a marginally improved butterfly keyboard that Apple described as a third-generation refinement. User reports of key failures continued. The 2019 MacBook Air existed in an uncomfortable position, a beautiful machine with a Retina display that buyers purchased while hoping the keyboard would not fail, in a product line that Apple's own repair data suggested was more likely to require keyboard service than any prior generation. You see, the irony was that the display Apple had finally delivered was genuinely excellent. It simply arrived attached to the most complained about keyboard in MacBook history. MacBook Air M1. November 17th, 2020, and Apple ships the first MacBook Air built on Apple Silicon, the M1 chip, and the laptop industry spends the following 3 months processing what had just happened. The M1 was a system-on-chip design that integrated the CPU, GPU, memory, and neural engine onto a single piece of silicon rather than connecting them across a motherboard through separate memory channels. The unified memory architecture meant the CPU and GPU shared the same memory pool at memory bandwidth speeds that no external RAM configuration could match. The base configuration offered 8 GB of unified memory and 256 GB of SSD storage, starting at $999. Benchmarks published in the weeks following release showed the M1 MacBook Air performing faster than the Intel MacBook Pro 13-inch in CPU tasks, matching or exceeding the Mac Pro in GPU-accelerated workloads, and sustaining peak performance without throttling because the M1 ran cool enough to require no cooling fan. The Air had always been fanless, but previous generations throttled under sustained load to manage heat that the M1 simply did not generate at the same rate. Battery life reached 18 hours in Apple's testing. Real-world reviews confirmed figures between 12 and 15 hours of active use, which was a doubling of what the previous Intel Air delivered. The machine weighed the same. It cost the same. It looked identical to the 2020 Intel Air. The only external difference was a slightly revised Magic Keyboard replacing the butterfly mechanism, a return to scissor switches that ended the keyboard by reliability complaints without fanfare or acknowledgement. The M1 MacBook Air did not compete with the best Intel laptops. It made the question of competition temporarily irrelevant. MacBook Air M2. June 2022. Announcement July 15th, 2022. Availability, and Apple delivers the MacBook Air's first complete design overhaul since 2010. The M2 Air abandoned the tapered wedge silhouette that had defined every Air since the second generation. The machine now maintained a uniform thickness of 11.3 millimeters from front to back, flatter and slightly wider than its predecessor. The display grew from 13.3 to 13.6 inches and gained the same notch camera housing that had divided opinion on the MacBook Pro a year earlier, accommodating a 1080 series FaceTime camera that replaced the 720p unit that had remained unchanged for a decade. MagSafe returned after a 4-year absence, restored to the left side alongside 2 Thunderbolt ports, the same port selection as the M1 Air, now with the magnetic charging connector that had been deleted with the 2018 redesign. The M2 chip delivered approximately 28% CPU performance improvement over M1 and meaningfully faster GPU throughput. The display reached 500 nits of brightness, 100 nits brighter than its predecessor, and supported 1 billion colors with True Tone. New color options included Midnight, a deep blue-black that picked up fingerprints as efficiently as any Surface Apple had ever shipped, and Starlight, a warm silver gold. The starting price rose to $1,199 from $999, a $200 increase that reflected the more expensive new design and chip. One documented issue emerged in independent testing. The base 256GB SSD in M2 MacBook Airs used a single NAND chip rather than 2, producing read and write speeds approximately 30 to 50% slower than the M1 equivalent. Apple never acknowledged this publicly. Buyers who configured 512GB or more received the dual-chip configuration and full SSD performance. MacBook Air M3. March 2024, and Apple releases the MacBook Air M3 in 2 sizes, 13.6 inches and 15.3 inches, at starting prices of $1,099 and $1,299 respectively. The 13-inch M2 dropped to $999 and remained in the lineup. The M3 chip moved to TSMC's 3nm fabrication process, the same architecture used in the M3 Pro and M3 Max inside the MacBook Pro lineup. CPU performance improved approximately 21% over M2 in sustained workloads. GPU efficiency improved more substantially, enabling hardware-accelerated ray tracing for the first time in the Air line. The design was identical to the M2 Air, same dimensions, same port selection, same weight, same display, same color options including the fingerprint. Attracting midnight. The headline feature was dual external display support, which the M1 and M2 Air had lacked, restricted in both previous generations to a single external monitor. The M3 Air supported two external displays simultaneously, but only in clamshell mode with the MacBook's lid closed. Operating with the built-in display active limited the machine to a single external monitor, the same as its predecessors. For users who worked primarily at a desk with the lid down, the dual display support was a genuine quality of life improvement. For users who worked with an external monitor alongside the built-in display, nothing changed. Reviewers described the M3 as a meaningful upgrade for M1 users and a marginal one for M2 owners, which accurately characterized where each generation sat on the performance curve. The 15-inch MacBook Air introduced with this generation gave buyers the screen size of a MacBook Pro with the fanless performance envelope of the Air, at a price $300 below the entry MacBook Pro. MacBook Air M4. March 5th, 2025, and Apple announces the MacBook Air M4, the most practically impactful single update the Air had received since the M1. The chip moved to TSMC's second-generation 3nm process, delivering approximately 2 times the performance of the M1 according to Apple's comparisons, with a 10-core CPU configuration featuring 4 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores alongside a 10-core GPU. Battery life reached a claimed 20 hours, the longest of any Air to date. The base RAM doubled to 16 gigabytes, ending the situation where a $999 laptop shipped with 8 gigabytes of unified memory in an era where that amount was increasingly a constraint for modern multitasking and AI-accelerated workflows. The webcam jumped from 1080p to 12 megapixels with center stage, in the feature that keeps the subject centered in frame during video calls using the wide-angle lens. Thunderbolt upgraded to version 4, enabling faster data transfer and greater external display bandwidth. Dual external display support now worked with the MacBook's lid open. The clamshell restriction that had defined the M3 was lifted. A new color called Sky Blue joined the lineup, replacing Space Gray. Fast charging support arrived, capable of recovering 50% battery in 30 minutes with a compatible adapter. The starting price dropped from $1,099 to $999 on the 13-inch, matching the entry price Apple had held for years before the M2 redesign raised it. Tom's Guide called it the best MacBook for most people, and in his assessment, the top laptop for most people outright. Wired praised its performance, display, camera, and battery life. The M4 Air landed without a significant criticism worth dwelling on. MacBook Air M5. October 15th, 2025, and Apple updates the MacBook Air with the M5 chip, maintaining the same design introduced with the M2 in 2022 and carried through the M3 and M4 generations. The M5 moves to a further refined process node, delivering additional gains in CPU and GPU throughput while preserving the fanless thermal design that has defined the Air since its introduction. The 12-megapixel center stage camera, Thunderbolt 4 port configuration, MagSafe 3 charging, and 16GB base RAM from the M4 carry forward unchanged. Battery life remains rated at up to 18 hours. The display stays at 500 nits with liquid retina technology, true tone, and P3 wide color. No promotion, 120Hz refresh rate, no OLED, which industry analysts note is currently reserved for future MacBook Pro generations rather than the Air. The 13-inch M5 Air starts at $999 and the 15-inch at $1,199. For users on M1 or M2, the upgrade to M5 delivers performance gains meaningful enough to notice across demanding tasks, including video editing, code compilation, and the growing category of on-device machine learning inference. For users on M3 or M4, the gains are incremental, and the practical recommendation across most reviews is to wait. The M5. MacBook Air is the current MacBook Air, a machine that has now maintained the same essential industrial design for 3 consecutive years across 3 silicon generations, proving that the chassis Apple built in 2022 had enough headroom to serve as the platform for a half-decade of processor improvements without requiring the industrial design team to return to the drawing board.